Thank you. I have an 8-month-old, our first at home, so I'm literally that that guy at home now. My arm's starting to get tired because he's gaining a lot of weight. So I have a problem, which is that I could easily speak to you for an hour about Tostan's work. I could then speak to you for an hour about social norms, and then probably do an additional hour on female genital cutting and child marriage. And then it sounded like from some of the earlier discussions we could do some therapy sessions around the political system and in this country and other countries. And Christina, I was thinking about your term pluralistic ignorance. That was also maybe applying to the debates recently. But what I wanted to do today is actually dive right in and in a very short amount of time try to share with you Tostan's model, our actual program in the field. And the reason I want to do that is because I think it's an actual embedded example of what we might call a norms-informed approach. And I say that very carefully. What I mean by a norms-informed approach is that Tostan did not sit down with the proverbial back of the napkin and say, hey, wow, look at this Schelling diagram. If we were to start working on social norms in this way, we could reach this tipping point here. What you had was a non-formal education program that had been built up over many decades, actually, and carefully through community feedback and lots of program input developed over time, but then at a certain moment began to get informed with the social norms perspective, and by our just sheer luck of being able to work with some of the best thinkers very early in this emerging and I think very important field. And so I call that out now because it isn't the case that it's theory leading the program. It's the program and the experiences in the program being underpinned and informed by the social norms perspective. So to tell you about our program, I want to actually take you to a village in rural Senegal, a village that looks like this, where there is a long list of development challenges that I don't even probably need to list to this room, but no clean water, health challenges, no education system to speak of, and if there is one, it's an exception. And lots of social problems, which a woman like Mariam Bamba would probably feel most acutely. Mariam never went to formal school at all. She went through female genital cutting. She was married at a very young age and had her first child and actually her second and other children at a very young age. And because of her status in the community, never participated in a lot of the decisions that were going on around her that greatly affected her life. At Tostan, one thing that we've really learned through our experiences is we've come to see women like Mariam not as individuals, and not only as individuals, but as part of these deep extended networks that she's a part of. And I don't just mean her family, although in West Africa, the family already would be a very large, just in terms of how that is defined, it'd be a very large thing. But also the broader community that's around her, and also I don't mean just that physical village that we were just looking at, but a much larger network. And in Mariam's case, she's a part of the Bambara ethnic group. And a lot of Bambaras migrated in the 19th century from Mali, in the early 20th century from Mali to Senegal. And that means that she's got a lot of extended family that she would immediately find a deep connection with, whether she's spoken to them recently or not, across a very broad swath. And those people matter, and their opinions matter about decisions that get made as well. And so if we were to look at that, and obviously the Bambara ethnic group is very unique in many ways, but it's also exemplary of some of the patterns we find in cultural norms and values in West Africa. What's valued? Well, things like the family and the social network, fulfilling one's role in society, respect and dignity, peace and unity. I don't know how many of you have been to West Africa, but you can easily hear the word jam in an introduction 10, 12, 15 times, because are you in peace? Is your family in peace? Are your animals in peace? It goes on and on, because that is such a deeply held value, and it's something that the culture always points back to, the peace among different ethnic groups, the peace within the family, etc. So what did Mariam go through when Tostan opened a class in her community? What we call the model now is the Community Empowerment Program. It's a 3-year basic education program running in national languages. And it was done by a facilitator who is from the region, typically, where the program is being implemented. Typically by someone who will be, the easiest way to say it is someone who's an insider and not an outsider, and who can navigate very easily. Or as we've come to say, is someone who's culturally congruent. That's a rather academic way to put it. And then the host community that we're working with would agree to house and feed the facilitator, would build or repurpose a classroom, and would kind of affirm the program. We typically are getting consent to what we're going to cover, and to make sure that they actually have the right mix of people to participate in the model very early on in our discussion. So we work with two main groups in each community. We're working with a class, or classes actually, and a community management committee. The community management committee is 17 members, 9 women and 8 men. And the classes are divided in two. There's 25 to 30 adolescents and 25 to 30 adults. And what we're doing in all that we do is coming out of a non-formal education approach. I love being in a room where the presenter before me has already mentioned Paulo Freire. It tells me an awful lot about the room I'm in. And I won't go into the technical definition, but for those of you in the room that maybe aren't familiar with non-formal education as an actual discipline, I would highly recommend looking into it. I think it's an underutilized approach in international development. The main difference to take away is that non-formal education is not formal education. That's kind of obvious in the name. But it's also not informal education, and that's one that often gets confused. Non-formal education is very carefully structured. It's very intentional. But it's also designed to be very learner-centered. And all education is somewhat learner-centered. But it's designed to be expressly learner-centered, to really center on the learner and what their emerging understanding is. So we talked earlier about all of those values, and one way to look at what's happening in Tostan's model is that we've created a way, again, we being the communities that we've worked with over many years, to have a model that allows the underpinning values to come into the dialogue. And so as communities are identifying future goals and identifying their aspirations, defining guiding principles, talking about what information they may already have or need, and then what skills, what resources do they have available. That's all happening in a context where the underpinning values are welcome and are being discussed. And we do that through human rights. And the first year of our program is the Kobe. That's a Mandinka word. It means to till the soil. And our program is relatively intense. We're talking about a 3-year model, and on the class side of the equation, 2 to 3 hours a day, 3 times a week for that 3 years. And so it's a very intensive commitment. So when the community assents to that and says these participants will come, that's a very real thing given their daily lives. The content of the Kobe is the visioning, building self-confidence, democracy, human rights, and responsibilities. And I won't have time to go into it, but I just note that one thing I think makes Tostan a little bit different is we always talk both about human rights and responsibilities related to those rights, always, every time, because it's a reciprocal relationship. And if you engage the responsibilities discussion, you're tapping into empathy, and you're tapping into opportunities for people to think beyond their own rights and into how they activate others' rights. We then move on to problem solving and hygiene and health. Just in case you want to know the sources for us, we mainly are using the Universal Declaration and the CEDAW. And we have many, there's 28 that we reference, but one of the ones I called out here was the right to be free from all forms of discrimination. So again, in a local language context, with a trained facilitator who has been over several months building up a space for safe dialogue, it would be about one of the questions is, when have you discriminated against someone? When has someone discriminated against you? Very powerful questions if asked in the right context and in the right ways. The second and third years are called the Aude. That means to plant the seed, and that's where we're going through literacy, math, microcredit, management, and small projects. And the idea is to create a safe space for adult and adolescent learners who aren't literate to be learning in. And so the first year is all dialogue and discussion, and then we do literacy. We found that when you start with literacy, you're asking adults to do something that's rather embarrassing and monotonous and can be challenging in a group setting, whereas if you're doing it in a context where it's more familiar and people are learning together, it works better. Oops, sorry. So that's a bit of the content. So what's the methodology? Well, the word fun is bolded and is enlarged, which might sound incongruent with the idea of talking about child marriage or female genital cutting, but the whole idea is to create a space where people are finding what they already know as relevant and welcomed. And so we use song and theater and dance and poetry, and all of our curriculum is based on local examples. So I had mentioned problem solving. In the problem solving session, what we're doing is referencing how does a baptism get planned? That's where we start. because it's very often, our classes have both men and women, but it's very often women who are participating very actively for the first time, and so that kind of an example allows them to share their experience, and then we can extrapolate a problem-solving process from that real-time example that they can take home and share with their friends. So oral tradition is very important in West Africa especially. These are not traditionally literate societies, and I say that knowing that, of course, in certain religious traditions there were literate people, but the broad idea of literacy as a norm has not yet emerged. And so now I come to what's very relevant to what we're talking about here today, which is the strategy that Tostan has used. And again, it's not a strategy we designed in abstract. It's a strategy that we've sort of learned into, and it's one that we call organized diffusion. And this man is Demba Jawara. He is the person who first pointed us towards social norms thinking. There had been a community that wanted to abandon female genital cutting in Senegal in 1997. They stood up as a single village and said, we're not going to do this anymore, and that created a whole lot of problems for them. And Demba came to see our founder and said, basically, that isn't going to work here. Their community is, and all of our communities are very small, but also very large. And he was referencing that extended network and kind of said, well, what can we do? We're, it was a very small NGO at that time. We can't program in every village in West Africa. And he said, no, I need to put on my shoes. And so Demba walked to 13 villages and mobilized the first collective decision-making around female genital cutting that allowed the social network to not be surprised and to start to think together and make it okay to discuss, and then okay to make to put a new option on the table. So what does that look like in our model today? Each participant in our class adopts another learner outside of the class, and then that creates a bridge. And that's, even if we weren't working on social norms, that's a good educational strategy, because then and that happens here. What did your friends think of what we discussed yesterday? Did you have a chance to talk to them? But again, in where we're working, the context where a woman can go home and be a teacher in some context is very, very powerful, and be a sharer. And when she goes to the well to find someone else and educate them is very powerful. Participants then hold village-level events to discuss issues that are coming up in the class, and they do that through the Community Management Committee, who is coordinating outreach. And that's a place, and it's not just about female genital cutting. It might be a place to talk about vaccinations. They might have discovered that there's some misunderstanding around what's going on when vaccination campaigns come through, or any other issue that bubbles up. The public forums are a way for communities to raise ideas to the village level. And then, as you remember for this slide, so if we look just at Mariam's Senegalese network, you may have been wondering what the pink dots were. When Tostan implements its model, we're implementing in a cluster of communities, and we're choosing to implement, well, first I should say we're always implementing in more than one village. And these days we're trying to implement in clusters of at least 30. Because what that allows us to do is to create a bit of density of what's going on and a critical mass of discussions at the local level, so that when Mariam goes to the market town, she may actually encounter someone else who is digesting and thinking about these same ideas. It seeds the network, so to speak, for social change. And then that is a precursor to what tends to happen later in our model in years 2 or year 3, where communities start coming together to organize inter-village meetings. And that's where we get into what Demba was first showing us, which is that the extended network, when possible, needs to be discussing what's going on, to have information that they may not have had, and to mobilize communities that aren't going through our program, but to begin to share out and help them understand what's happening. That can lead, it doesn't always lead to public declarations, where you can have a large number of communities coming together, as I said earlier, to create a new option, to create a new choice, to say after today, it is okay if you don't cut your daughter. After today, it is okay we will not, your daughter will not face the same level of social exclusion as everyone was expecting previously. So this is Mariam. Mariam's reached out now to hundreds of communities. She's become a real campaigner on this issue in Senegal. And this, surrounding her, is her social mobilization team, which is a great example of the kind of work that the community management committees are often doing. They're going out to mobilize, to encourage other communities to come to discussions, to start a dialogue. And again, presenting it this way makes it sound perhaps easy or something. These are not easy discussions. I don't mean to oversimplify that at all. Someone earlier said, had asked a question, and the answer that came to me was, one of the ways we can work well is to trust those that we're working with and leave the final actions and decisions to them. That's, I think, a really powerful way to approach programming. It's hard, but it's a powerful way to work. So Mariam's Village did end up ending FGC and child marriage. They built a health hut. They elected a woman to the rural council. They built a middle school. And 2 women were elected to lead the parent association. And just a word about attribution in these non-formal education models. And it's an interesting paradox for us, because actually those results are their results, and Tostan is not trying to claim those. But we also want this space to get the recognition for the potential it has to help communities. And so we're working on a new M&E project to kind of build out with rigor how we make those cases. Before I close, I wanted to mention a very new development. We have been working on early childhood development. We have found through a very kind of another random sequence of events, we were encouraged to work on this issue, and it gelled with some of the things we'd been seeing locally. We found a lot of norms at the local level around not interacting with children at an early stage. Parents who are losing 1, sometimes 2 or 3 children at very young age in rural contexts where there's very low health care and very little understanding of what is actually harming their children. They come up with explanations, and sometimes those explanations are superstitious, and over time that has led to don't show too much attention to the child, don't look the baby in the eye, things that really do have consequences in terms of the educational development when they then get into a formal school context and are coming at a very different level than in other contexts. And so we are actually now integrating into the community empowerment program. We're teaching brain development in local languages using lots of fun metaphors and language, and it is like one of the most popular things we've done in a long time. And parents like me are very encouraged to find out any information. It's so true what you were saying about men. We have no good, I have a great dad, but we have no common open models of how to be in that first moment when you're first holding them. It's like, what? And some of that is just natural and normal, but I do think we can do more. I might just close, yes, so this is Mariam's granddaughter. So she embodies, I think, the change that's happened in her community. But I might close with more of just a note about this room. I think 10 years ago, this conference, this discussion wasn't happening around social norms, or if it was, I wasn't finding it on Google, or where, I was trying to find it. And I think the fact that we've come this far and that this is happening is a testament to those that are organizing it and to all of you in this room. And I think in 10 more years, when social norms thinking, social norms informed programming has elevated up to where it needs to be, I think we're going to look back at some of the leaders in this room, some of whom have left now, but many of you here who have been at the outset of this. And I think that's going to be tremendously important for international development. So thank you.